There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing it all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that will lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of the comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. So, what do spies do or learn in their trade that most of us might find would be useful for applying every day? Well, the first thing we're going to say is it turns out that spies in real life are not like the movie portrayals of them. So sad to say they're not all James Bond kind of characters. But they do have some incredibly useful skills in connecting to people and with a few other places as well. And sometimes connecting to people that they don't necessarily like. And so I think we're in for both a fascinating discussion and some real insights in your own communication and persuasion path. So my guest today is Jeremy Hurewitz. He's spent the first stage of his career overseas, kind of building a media association empire called Project Syndicate. Took that from a few dozen newspapers to mostly in Eastern Europe to over 300 newspapers in over 100 companies. And he still does write for Bloomberg and US Today and a few others. But then returning to the US after that overseas assignment, he started working at a big consulting firm, and especially in the world of corporate security. And while you're working in corporate security, you can imagine that you're going to run into a lot of former intelligence officers, whether they're FBI or law enforcement or Secret Service or military or whatever, and started learning that they had some rather unique skills. And then when he started using those skills, he's noticed that his salesmanship and his ability to connect with clients really escalated. So that's what we're talking about. He's taken all these lessons and synthesized this into a book called Sell Like a Spy. And there's also a program that goes with it. And that's what he's doing now, sharing these strategies and tactics with clients. If you want to know more, go to the website, selllikeaspy.net. So Jeremy, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, Wanda. Great to be with you.
It's fabulous. I love the title too. And what an interesting approach. All right, why? I know you said the why is that you were working with these people who had been in intelligence and you learned something about selling from them. But was there a particular moment that stood out for your interaction with people that you suddenly say, wait a minute, here's something I need to pay attention to?
It was more like rather than one moment, more like a period of time. There were a couple of case officers I'm thinking of. One used to operate under non-official cover. The other one did have diplomatic cover. The one who had diplomatic cover was a lapsed Mormon, which is an interesting background. The CIA actually recruits a lot from the Mormon communities. But both of these guys were very much not the James Bond image. They speak to this joke in the spy world that spies are almost always typically medium everything, medium height, medium stature. Because if you're a spy at a diplomatic event, is it better to be someone who's a heartthrob that everyone's following around and tracking and remembering, or someone who's medium everything that can kind of materialize in and out of conversations? And both of these guys were extraordinarily good at building rapport, at connecting with our clients, with clients that I knew they didn't particularly like and they didn't particularly even trust, but they knew how to build rapport with them and get them to move along on things that we wanted them to do. So I just watched these two individuals who were the opposite of kind of the alpha male image, and how effective they were at doing their job and connecting with people. And I sort of started to realize, hey, there's really something to how these people operate that I can learn from.
Okay, so if you could distill that down, what is it that they were doing in connecting with people that was a bit unique?
So the one I mentioned that was a lapsed Mormon, he was so good at active listening, and maybe we'll get into that. He had a way of sort of being self-deprecating and making the conversation about you and how impressive you are and what he wanted to learn from you. So he used kind of flattery, deep listening, and to sort of cultivate me. And I wound up feeling favorably disposed towards him. And I watched this guy who seemed like such a mellow character, who was really a canny operator. And he moved, up the corporate food chain very quickly because he was a great individual maneuvering. And the other guy was so intellectually omnivorous. Like, I felt like there was not one topic that he couldn't have a robust conversation on. And it wasn't because he was a polymath and knew everything about every subject. It was because he had sincere intellectual curiosity, and an interest in things and an ability to put people at ease. So these were some of the methods I saw used at first.
Okay, so let me back up for just a minute before I go diving in, because I want to know more. I want to know what they do. I want how they do it. I want to, et cetera. But we do have to dispel this myth that spies are like what we see in the movie, that they live a glamorous life, that they're always eating out in fancy restaurants and dress in elaborate clothes and stay in expensive hotels and drive fancy cars and. You said at the beginning, no, they are average. Do you want to say a little bit more about what spies are really like?
Yeah, I mean, well, spies run the gamut. I've worked with some spies that are very good looking, men and women for sure. Big, tall, fat, skinny, all of that, But the joke that they're a medium everything is there's something to that. That's why I think I disappoint audiences when I point out that your average spy is going to look more like a frumpy academic than Daniel Craig. So that gets a laugh, and people say, oh, I feel a little bad about the fantasy image, but it's not really how they operate. And a lot of spies will tell you that they feel closer to the idea of a therapist or a psychiatrist than they do of what you see in Hollywood, because the agents that they recruit often wind up confiding in them and being close to them, closer than even their spouse, because they wind up being able to tell their handlers things that they can't tell anybody else, national security secrets, but then really personal things as well, because of the world that they enter into. So, these misconceptions are the result of Hollywood, who shows us, spies that are quasi superheroes like Jason Bourne or Jack Ryan, or suave kind of seductors like James Bond with a license to kill, and it's just a fallacy.
Yeah, it sells good movies and it makes for interesting entertainment. I'm not sure it's effective. And I take your point. If I have somebody that I want to not be noticed, to blend into the background and be able to maneuver in and out of scenarios, scenes, people, I don't want them to really stand out and draw attention too much to themselves. That makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so core skills. Let's talk about this. You've talked already about their ability to develop connections. You've talked about a little bit about their listening skills and not mentioned it, but somewhere in there, the empathy. Let's start with the connections. And what I really want to know, Jeremy, is how. Mm-hmm. We all think we know how to make connections, but there's something special about what these individuals, and I might say it's not just spies, it's a whole walk of life, hostage negotiators, a lot of people that learn to build these deep connections. So clue us into what's unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with spies. And what I do in a lot of my talks, and certainly in my book, is I use what I call spy quotes, which are quotes from intelligence professionals that I use to illuminate a certain concept. And my favorite spy quote is that every good intelligence officer has a real bond with their target on some level and in some regard. And that is a contradiction of what we see in Hollywood, where spies are coercing people by blackmailing them or what have you into cooperating. Blackmail doesn't work. Certain unsavory agencies like the Russians, maybe the Chinese, others might use blackmail as a tactic, but it backfires on spies. If you're being blackmailed, you despise that person. You can become a double agent. You can feed, false intelligence. The CIA trains its case officers to connect really deeply with their agents, and they assess motivation. Which is something I think people in the sales world and, everyday life can do a lot better on. What do people think? Oh, I'm a charming, person and I have a great product or service or whatever it is, that person should bend to my will. But spies understand that understanding the motivation about the other side, that person comes from a minority group in this Middle Eastern country. They've been passed over for a promotion so many times. That person needs money. Signals intelligence has indicated that, or they've indicated that they have a sick child in their impoverished country. They can't get the health care they need. What is the motivation to get this person to cooperate? And then they find they utilize the connective tools they've been taught. And you were, I think, hinting at this. There's a notion of what's known as radical empathy, which is a really important tool in the toolkit of case officers, because when you step back and think about it, spies aren't usually recruiting people they would otherwise choose to be friends with, right? They often have to recruit criminals or terrorists, diplomats from some really bad places who do really bad things. And they have to find that kernel of humanity in that person. And everybody has it, everybody, even the most nefarious person has something that makes them human human and sympathetic. And spies are trained to understand that. And there's a great quote that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who supposedly said, "I don't like that person. I must get to know him better." So you can take it as a challenge to find that core of humanity. And then spies leverage intellectual curiosity, which we talked about here. They screen for that a little bit in the process of recruitment. And then they actually do training exercises to put people together from different backgrounds and encourage them to flex that muscle of intellectual curiosity. That becomes so important for people with different backgrounds. And then finally is vulnerability. If you make yourself vulnerable, you wind up bridging that intimacy gap when you're trying to create a relationship with somebody, even someone who's holding you at arm's length. I talk about in the book a very personal anecdote of mine, how I made myself vulnerable consistently. Happy to chat about that. But it's, very briefly, I had a brain tumor a little over 10 years ago. It was benign, fortunately. But as a result of the procedure, I lost all my hearing in my right ear. And that comes up tactically, Wanda. If I'm walking with you on the street, I keep you on my left side. If I arrive late for a luncheon and everybody's seated and it's loud, I might ask if I can swap seats with somebody to, sit so I can hear everybody. And I can't tell you how many times in a business environment this has come up with somebody keeping me at arm's length, having their business armor up, and all of a sudden they draw closer to me because, not everybody experiences tragedy, but we all experience misfortune. And there's a powerful side of behavioral science, and there's many aspects of behavioral science spies use and FBI agents. I write a lot about it to get people to respond in certain ways. And in this particular moment, people respond in kind. They tend to share something about themselves or a loved one. And what happens is your humanity is showcased, and the intimacy gap is shortened. So those are ways that they make connections. Just a final point with that. A spy in my book talks about how he has a son on the autism spectrum. He was based in the Middle East a lot, where discussions of family were a big focus. And he would mention this, and so many times people that he was looking to connect with would relate challenges that they had with their children, and that intimacy gap would be narrowed. So spies know how to do this and share very deeply.
Okay. All right, I'm going to have to come back and ask you, wait, this sounds manipulative, but I'm going to come back to that one. Let me stay with this notion of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. I have certainly heard in my world where people say, like a woman being pregnant. It's clear that she's pregnant. She talks about the pregnancy or is showing that she's pregnant. Suddenly her clients relate to her in a different way. And that humanity that comes through in that moment carries for years and decades beyond that. So that's what you're saying. But how do I do that more intentionally? Like, is this, it feels strange to admit a weakness, which is what we're saying about a vulnerability, but yet that's a key element for getting people to open up to you.
Yeah, the weakness becomes a strength, if you do it right. There's probably a quote that I could pull from Sun Tzu in The Art of War that says something like that, but it's an absolute truth. And it doesn't have to be something really heavy, like me sharing about my hearing, even though that comes up tactically. I don't even necessarily mean to sort of use it as a tool. It's my experience to use as I see fit. You know what I mean? It's something that happened to me, but it's not like I'm trying to exploit that. It comes up, you know what I mean? And so when it does, it has that effect. But just about anything, even a small thing, like I can be a troubled sleeper. If I show up for a meeting with somebody and I'm like, I just had the worst night of sleep last night, apologies if I miss a word here or there or something like that. That triggers that as well. Someone says, oh, my wife has trouble sleeping or something like that. Or if you show up and you're like, oh, my kid was just would not cooperate this morning. I'm sorry, I'm late. Something small like that relates to your common humanity. And that person might say, my kid's a pain in the butt too, and I had a hard time doing that. So there are so many ways that you can, share like that. And I happen to wear my heart on my sleeve, and I'm comfortable with vulnerability. And I talk about this in my talks, though, because not everybody's comfortable with sharing. So I understand that can be a challenge. And I tell people to try these skills in their everyday life. So if I was talking to somebody and coaching them on using this skill, if they weren't as comfortable with it, I would ask them to start with their friends and family by sharing something that they wouldn't maybe normally share, and watch the way that they respond, and then start to move into your business career and start to figure it out. And you don't want to go to your first meeting with a prospect and say, my grandmother just died of leukemia last night. Obviously, you need to read the room and be appropriate, but figuring out ways that you can open yourself up, make yourself vulnerable, and showcase that humanity is turning a strength into a weakness. A weakness into a strength, pardon me.
Yeah. And if we follow any of the work on trust, is those seeds of vulnerability from you that I show to people, and then that you reciprocate, which is really the seed that builds the trust. And what you're talking about is how do we get this trust built to a stronger degree so that you will tell me the things I need to know to really succeed at what I'm trying to achieve. All right. So can you go too far in the vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just showed that if you're inappropriate and you lack emotional intelligence and you share the wrong thing at the wrong time, it can backfire. You need to be, you need to develop your emotional intelligence. You need to read the room. You need to be reading the cues from people, and you need to figure out kind of the right time to use something like that. And there's no, unfortunately, one blueprint about when you should or shouldn't share something. But I think if you're, arriving late and you want to relate something that's been a big challenge in your day and sharing that's fine, and I think that you just really have to calibrate the moment, the individual, and what it is you're trying to share.
Right. I can imagine also it's easier on not the first meeting, and it's easier one-to-one than it is one-to-many. So there are some parameters that would probably make a difference. It also strikes me that when I'm talking about myself, it's easy then for the conversation to become about me, which is what I want to ultimately do, is to get the other person to open up. Any advice on how to keep it from becoming about me?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a whole kind of workshop I work on, a section in my book about using your superpowers. What are 3 core things that you can have in your back pocket to talk about going to that networking event, going on a first date, whatever it is, to break the ice. And I always tell people, specifically to your point, this is not an excuse to grandstand. There are moments it's great for you. You're in the zone and you're telling funny stories, and that's great. That's a great way to build rapport and connect with people. But when I talk about using your superpowers, it's about sharing as a bridge. So when I'm in a business meeting, if someone starts talking about golf, I do want to leverage my intellectual curiosity, but I don't like golf and it's boring to me. So if I can shift the subject to another sport, baseball, which I'm passionate about, I don't have to be the one talking, but I know that I'll be a better listener and better conversationalist for that person if we're talking about a subject that I find interesting. So it's sharing as a bridge. If you can lead the conversation into an area that you are genuinely interested in, it will help you be a better active listener.
Yeah. Reminds me of a very senior executive of one of my financial services company a number of years ago said, and you wouldn't have expected this comment coming from him because he was a numbers guy. And he said, I'll find out more about you in 2 minutes of hearing you talk about anything you're passionate about than I'll ever know in a 2-hour presentation on your strategy. And by the way, I care more about the former than the latter. And it was just admitting that is what I use to make a judgment on whether I'm buying into you and to what you're proposing. So I thought it was an interesting, and you would not have believed that having just met him on the surface.
Totally. That's really cool.
Okay. All right. So the things are, I want to be aware of what kind of vulnerabilities I might want to share, could share, aware of the moments that I would like to say something about them. And I'm sharing as a way of bridging to get other people to find something in that they can relate about. So it's not just to say, let me tell you how horrible my hearing is, it's let me tell you about what I need from a seating perspective in order to be a better listener. And there's a bridge in that. Well, we're looking for other people to add to it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go to this notion of motivation. You said you want to find in sort of the human, what's the motivation for people to talk to you? Mm-hmm. Now, in the spy world, we're looking for a motivation for people to share secrets. In the business world, we're looking for a motivation to tell you their opinion, to give you feedback, to get involved. There's a different range of emotions. But how do I begin to uncover what somebody's motivation is?
It's a great question. And I talk to people in the business world, and I think it's a blind spot in the business world. The salesperson, even the significant top level BD person or CEO doing a pitch thinks I'm a charming person. I have a great product or service. This person should want to buy from me. But doing your homework a little bit and understanding. So for instance, maybe you're going in to pitch a company there's a manager that was newly installed. Maybe she had a power struggle with the previous person. And she's now rethinking the relationship with all the vendors because she wants to have a group of vendors that are, she feels comfortable working with, that she's made the decisions about. So that's a motivation. So trying to get the intel on the company, and who's the new manager, what are they about, what's the atmospherics? Do you have anybody in the company that could tell you what happened, how this person became manager? Those are things you should be thinking about strategically. Or is it, hey, this company I'm going into pitch has had 2 bad quarters in a row and they're potentially facing budget cuts. I have the intel on that. It's a private company. Or I can see, because they're publicly traded. So the motivation might be they're trying to make some budget cuts. If I can come in with a really good price, talk with my manager, come in and really wow them with that could win the day. So understanding that, and we can relate that also to what I call the atmosphere and intangibles, the other things that surround culture that can influence the sale. But trying to assess a motivation instead of just going in blind and thinking, I'm just going to pitch here and hope they like it, is a better strategy than just going in cold.
Again, another very senior salesperson in a financial services firm says, he gets so frustrated that people will go in and just pitch their product. I know more about your company than you know about, and here you need our product because this will save the day and blah, blah, blah. And he says, what a disaster.
Yep.
Because you got to go in and listen as the first thing. Because if you're not listening, then you're not really understanding where their pain point is.
Totally.
And until you understand their pain point, you have no idea what you need to propose to them. So it's the same idea, trying to understand the pain point, the motivation, why somebody would talk to you about it. So is that just as simple, Jeremy, as listening? Or do you have any other tips? I'll get the intel. I'll ask people who knows this individual. I'll look for transitions, who, why, how. Anything else that I can do that will help me understand motivation?
Yeah, elicitation is a method to use to, try to get information in a little bit more of a circumspect manner. So asking a certain question that might not actually be about the specific thing you want to know, to discern it, is something that can help you understand their motivation or what's going on within a company. So, you can elicit something that will tell you a little bit more about what might be going on with that individual, that company, and what might, trigger the tendency to buy.
Okay. And we're talking about this in sales, but it would work just as effectively trying to get that other department to collaborate with me or to produce something on time or to spend some extra resources on something. All right. So elicitation. Can you give me an example of an elicitation question?
I can give you a couple if you'd like. One from everyday life. And just actually very quickly, Wanda, if I was to say to you, hey, Wanda, is your favorite color is red, right? And you might say to me, no, my favorite color is not red, it's blue. And what I'm doing there is leveraging the very powerful side of human beings, which is a tendency to correct. Human beings are vain. All of us are. We're all the stars of our own little universe. And there's no detail too small about ourselves that we don't feel strongly compelled to correct. So it would have been very strange for you to reply and say, no, my favorite color is not red. You would go further and make sure that I know what your favorite color is. So, it won't happen 100% of the time, but I don't know, 95%. Such a high percentage of the time when you want to learn something about somebody, you can elicit that by getting them to correct the record about themselves. There are other triggers for elicitation. The tendency, the flattery is a good one. When you flatter someone in our society, they tend to become kind of self-deprecating. So if you asked somebody a very specific question about how they became successful, they might answer in a certain way and keep it kind of basic. But if you flatter them about their success, they might be more forthcoming and say something more useful to you than that. So there's a variety of ways to trigger elicitation to get at the heart of something.
It's great. By the way, red is not my favorite color, just for the record. Everybody always asks me that. I got stuck into red because the cover of the book is this beautiful red, and then suddenly it just shows up everywhere. So I guess it all works. But
what is your favorite color then? Or are you going to be the exception to the norm?
Oh, my favorite color is green.
Okay, well, there you go.
See, now you know something about me. All right. So I'm taking that time to build a connection. I'm building connection by showing some vulnerability. I'm trying to look at the person's motivation, and you gave me two great tactics. One is to make a statement and then give people a chance to correct it, or give a flattery, and then they'll, go into some more detail about that, and that would reveal something about them. I'm listening for that one. Now, you also talked about intellectual curiosity as a way of connecting. And I watch people who are really good at building rapport in the room, and there's almost no topic somebody would bring up, let's say at a networking event, that they can't find a hook on to ask another question and to have a genuine interest in. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think that's generally what I mean. The example I give in the book, and I wind up talking about, is a guy training at the farm, who came from an elite background, upper class, Ivy League, big city on the East Coast, was paired at the farm. And when he was training with somebody with a rural background, grew up lower class, and he's an avid hunter. So that person from the upper class side doesn't need to pretend he's a hunter and knows all about it. That would backfire on him probably pretty quickly. All he has to do is very genuinely engage with that person and be curious about what is hunting like? What does he get out of it? Where does he hunt? What does he hunt? So those are things when we encounter people from different cultures or different walks of life, people wind up, I'm so surprised by people sometimes because really all they want to do is talk about themselves and how, and brag a little bit and talk about the experience they have. And you can see this on their face, their body language. They're so impatient to tell you their story, and once you see that, I go, okay, and I'm just going to be quiet and let that, if it's somebody I'm looking to cultivate, if it's somebody I'm not, I just really don't normally want to spend time with that vain person as much. But cultivating intellectual curiosity will benefit not only for your connectivity, it'll open you up to this rich world. And I'm kind of on a mission to get people to live richer lives, using your superpowers to open yourself up to different, I believe if you use your superpowers, other sales opportunities will open themselves for you. You want to be a person with a lot of passions and interests, and being curious about the world is one of the best things I think you can be. So cultivating that isn't only about closing that sale, it's about leading a richer life.
It strikes me, though, so it's easy, I find it relatively easy, maybe other people don't, to ask questions to get someone else to talk, okay? But then there's this pressure that, especially in business, I need to add something of value to the conversation. So how do you advise people to balance between the asking questions and listening and providing their own input?
Yeah, there's a quote that I like from John le Carré, the writer. It's in my book about how spies are entertainers. Like he says something to the effect of, if I invite you to lunch, I need to be somebody that's worthy of your attention, that you want to spend time with, that will be entertaining and interesting. So I write a lot about people active listening, stepping back, eliciting information. But I think it's because I think there's a need for that. But it's absolutely important to be a compelling personality that people enjoy spending time with. I happen to be a little bit of a wild card that lived overseas, and I have a lot of different interests, and I've had some funky experiences. I can be an entertaining guy. So that kind of comes to me more naturally, and the active listening are things that I've had to work at. But it's a little bit of a balance. Am I digressing there, or did I kind of answer that for you?
I think you answered it, because I think what you're saying is I have to divulge a bit about me in order to get you to divulge more about me. That's a vulnerability.
Yes.
But I have to be curious about you and get you talking as well. I can't dominate the show.
Absolutely, but it's also getting back to that intellectual curiosity and using your superpowers, being a person with passions, being a person with interests, and when I tell people, tell me your superpowers, I want to hear at least one of the three is something esoteric. It's fine if you're like, straight down the fairway, golf, family, and church or something like that, right? But I'm looking for someone who says like, well, I'm just really passionate about French cooking, or I'm a scuba diver, or I collect stamps. You might find a little bit of less a group of people who are specifically interested in that. But when you do, number one, boy, are you going to hit it off. And number two, people might be like, wow, that's really cool. Like, where do you scuba dive, or stamp collecting? That's really odd, so being a person with passions will open the door for you, and it will, lead to more connectivity in some serendipitous ways.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about superpowers as much as about topics that you're passionate about. Other than a skill I have, a capability I have. So I think that's an interesting way to approach it. All right, so I've got finding the motivation in the other person. I've got intellectual curiosity. I've got having some vulnerability. I've got, in finding motivation, giving people a chance to correct something about themselves or say something flattering, and then they will give you more details. We've got all of that part. All right, now, particularly when it's someone I just don't like. Because one of the things that strikes in all of this is that there isn't a genuineness that comes across from me to the person I'm trying to connect with. If I have a judgment in my head of this person is good or bad, worthy, not worthy, whatever, it's going to come across and I'm going to fail. So how do I stop that judgment, particularly for people I don't necessarily value?
I think it gets back to radical empathy, you know,
Okay.
understanding that, hey, this person, I'm a case officer in the CIA, this person is an international criminal. But you know what? They just were talking to me about their daughter and how much they love their daughter, you know, or this person is a terrorist and has blood on his hands. But I also know that they are deeply devoted to charitable causes in their home country. And I know that they've gone out of their way to do that. Spies are adept at living in an ambiguous world and understand that people are complex. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind about how complex people are. If you meet somebody that you don't like, and especially that you find ethically dubious, you should walk away from that person unless you have a real need to, from a business sense. Maybe it's your spouse's family and they're somebody that you know you're going to be around for many years. Hopefully they're not so nefarious, but they just might be, you know, in our highly polarized political environment on the other side of the political table. So I think there's a real need for using that radical empathy to say there's a core of humanity in this person, and I want to find that, and I want to bridge that gap. So amongst all the things I've talked about, I think that radical empathy and finding and respecting the humanity that's there in just about anybody is the pathway forward.
I always say in a business context, particularly when you're working with a senior that you don't necessarily get along with or necessarily like their personality, I'm assuming they're not being unethical as in breaking the law. That's a whole other different story in a corporation. But somebody somewhere values that person for something.
Right.
What is that thing? It's the same idea. It's finding the piece about them that is worthy, if you will.
Tactical empathy, radical empathy, whatever you want to call it. It's looking for that.
Okay. All right. So give me some tools. How do I go about doing that?
Conversation, trying to elicit what's important to them, getting beyond the ugly side of them. And, you know, if you want to find, maybe family is one that you know, are related to. Once you get someone talking about their kids, there's hopefully a softness that opens up. So if you, instead of asking directly if they have kids, if you bring up yours, or if you talk about something with kids and then they bring up their kids, you're going to hopefully soften a little bit as they say, yeah, you know, this person who is the most arrogant, you know, financial services professional around all of a sudden says, oh, my kid just started Little League. He's so cute. He's doing this and that. And all of a sudden you see a different side of this person who was a toweringly arrogant jerk a minute ago and treating you dismissively, you know, a moment ago. And I think we've all been in that situation. So, you know, that's a good way to do that. Elicitation offers a chance. So, and it's the same way of using your superpowers. It's sharing as a bridge. You're bridging to get to that side of the person that is the better side. That is the side that you can try to connect with to get beyond the prickly exterior.
Yeah. I've had that exact experience with somebody who was arrogant, obnoxious. You can fill in every other word you wanted to in financial services. And I swear to you, the moment you get him talking about his kids, there's a whole other personality that comes out.
Exactly.
And you would know that he was willing to talk about his kids because there's photos all over his office.
Right. But if you walk in there, he's probably very savvy. And if you look at those pictures of the kids, you start asking about it, he's going to know, hey, this person's trying to soften me up. And they're going to use that as a tactic. But if you start talking about your kids, or you're talking about your siblings' kids, or, you know, whatever the case may be, if you don't have kids, you know, that is a way to get that person talking about it. But that's why elicitation's so good. If you start saying things that are asking questions that are really on the nose, it can bring about the opposite response: cynicism, defensiveness. And those financial services guys, they are not keen to be sold to. They're masters of the universe. You know, it's their territory. So those tactics are really important there.
That's right. In this particular case, what I did was ask, is that a recent photograph?
That's cool.
Which is an easy, gentle way in. And then, you know, it was easy to say, oh, yeah, well, my kids are whatever ages, or what's your son into, or what's your daughter into. There was a quick, and I also contend it's got to be a couple of minute conversation. You can't try to discover everything about somebody in one 15-minute conversation.
No,
so,
definitely not. Yeah.
Piece by piece evolved. Okay, so radical empathy. I start with the conversation. I'm trying to find something that's important to that person. We're back to that motivation thing, some human part of them, something that we have in common. Any other tactics for getting over my judgment, my dislike of this person?
I don't know if I have another tool there for you, just trying to focus on the end goal and understanding that, we're all fallible. We all have different sides of our personality. One of my favorite quotes is the famous Walt Whitman quote, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Respecting the fact that everybody has multitudes, and that arrogant private equity managing director you're talking to has people in their life that love them deeply, probably, and potentially serve on boards, or have a pet or a child, somebody that they show deep affection towards, and maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they had a bad deal, maybe they're sick of being sold to. So trying to how did Gary Nessner in my book, the former FBI hostage negotiator, talk about it? Being a duck with the water rolls off your back is really important. Not taking it personally. Someone might say to him, you're a real jerk, Gary. And he goes, well, my wife thinks so sometimes too, but why don't you tell me what's bothering you? Like, not taking it personally when someone is treating you that way and being dismissive, and still trying to push on to find that humanity is the path forward.
All right, so there's a bit of staying with it. There's a bit of looking at what is something we have in common. There's a bit of allowing people to be complex characters, some parts of which we like, some parts of which we don't like. And it's that, again, we're right back to that connection. Right back to that connection. All right, so let's shift to one of your other favorite topics, which is active listening. It's so easy to say. We've all heard what active listening is about. We all do a horribly bad job, especially today with divided attention spans. Yep. So walk us through what active listening really looks like, and how do we get better at it?
Yeah. Well, I always say about active listening that there's no one technique or, trick I can teach, button you can push, unfortunately, to turn you into a great active listener. It's about committing yourself to an active listening practice over a long period of time. And I always ask people at my talks, and I pause after I ask this question, think of the greatest listener you've ever experienced. I pause and I wait just a moment and I say, I'm sure you have a very high opinion of that person, because when we're listened to, we feel respected, we feel seen. So this is a huge goal. I call it the most important skill for any spy or salesperson. Great active listening skills. Everything flows from that. The eliciting of information, finding that kernel of humanity, it's all there. And if you're an introvert, sometimes people shy away from sales because they think I have to be a gregarious person, and a lot of people in sales are, but they have a leg up in some ways on being a good salesperson if they can listen really well to their clients and get to their pain points, as you noted. But the natural impediments to active listening are huge. When archaic man was first evolving language, it was short clipped phrases, because they would look out on the savannah and they would, have to quickly say something to somebody and communicate, because they were looking for things they could kill and eat and things they needed to avoid being killed and eaten by. So that's how it evolved. And that's still how we think. When someone's talking to us, we get the gist of what they're saying, and then we go back inward and we start to think about our witty reply or anecdote. We're all listening with an intention to reply, not necessarily an intention to understand. But if you can shift that and put aside your witty reply or anecdote and just focus on the clarification question you're going to ask to continue to get that person to speak, you're going to be ahead of the game. And just a couple other behavioral science aspects of why it's so hard. We comprehend 4 times faster than our ability to speak. So you see this when you're talking to somebody, they're nodding, then they become impatient with their body language, and sometimes they finish your sentence for you because they know where you're going before you finish many times, because that's the way the brain works. And then there's the fact, and this is a controversial number, but some say up to 90% of our comprehension of a conversation is about body language and tone of voice, and only 10% are the words. That varies, it could vary on the day, the individual, but most people agree that a majority of our comprehension is this kind of formula. And there's an analogy for that too when people find it shocking. I always point to, if you really like a song, you might not know all the lyrics. You might only know the chorus or just a couple lyrics, but you understand the emotional meaning of the song, because the melody is the body language and tone of voice, and the lyrics are the words. So understanding how our mind works with conversation, and understanding you need to make a willful effort to steady your body language, make consistent but not creepy eye contact, and look for that clarification question rather than the witty reply. There's time for a witty reply. We've talked about the entertainment factor in cultivation, but when it comes to active listening, go for that clarification question rather than the witty reply.
It strikes me again that this is where intellectual curiosity really comes into play, because if you're saying something and I can get curious about what it means, about why you came to that conclusion, about what you think the implications are, about where you've seen this before, and I can ask those kind of questions, we're going to keep the conversation going. I'm going to keep you talking.
Definitely. I mean, and everything flows from that. Again, people you just let them talk, they're going to tell you much more than they probably originally intended to state. So that's a great way to, get a background on somebody, get some intelligence, find those pain points, find that common humanity. Just let them talk.
Okay. All right. So still in the business world, I got to impress somebody else. So am I really going to impress them by just listening? Is there something else I need? I mean, I have to say some things for sure.
Yeah.
I have to have some meaningful contribution. How do I dampen down that anxiety about my need to say and make a contribution?
Well, damping down your anxiety is a little bit beyond my field, but the breathing techniques are really good. Actually, it's not. I say something in my book about this, and if you beyond having passions, and adding those to your life and how that opens the door, I talk to people when it comes to active listening about how valuable it is to have a certain practice. Like I practice yoga, and I think that's given me like a steadiness and a calmness. And I use the analogy, if I'm doing a difficult pose, if my mind is not clear and focused on what I'm doing, I'm going to fall over, on the balance side of things. And it's already challenging with my ear and what happened there. So I have to really concentrate, and it's forced me to do that. And I tell people any kind of exercise practice really puts you in the moment, and it really helps you focus. And if you can take that focus and that practice to conversation, you won't be as anxious. You'll be in the moment a little bit more. And you should feel confident about, having your superpowers in your back pocket as a place to go with the conversation. If you feel it's getting awkward and you don't know what to ask about, having those three things as tools can give you that sense of assurance in your back pocket that I know where to go with this conversation in case we get an awkward silence.
Right. I know I find that if you just are listening with the intent of summarizing the core points, so I'm trying to get at what the essence that you're saying is, and I ask clarifying questions, and then I play that back. I find that is incredibly powerful in drawing people towards you. So it's such a simple skill, but man, is it a powerful one when you do use it. Okay.
Totally.
All right, then let's shift again. So you mentioned it already. Somewhere between 80 and 90%, I think, are the running bets that are out there of the communication comes through in the body language, the tone of voice, the body posturing, not in the words themselves. And you certainly know examples where I can take the same sentence with a different tone of voice and a different facial expression and convey the polar opposite meaning.
Definitely.
So what are the body language pieces we need to be paying attention to? Because you said already, read the room. Okay, what am I reading? What am I looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I like to say about body language is that, no matter what anybody tells you, no one, behavior means one thing. Okay. And I like to point out that if your arms crossed, we think, okay, well, that means that you're not, pleased with what's going on right now. It's considered a blocking behavior, and it often is. And we can talk about what that means. But I was at a music show the other night, and I realized I was standing there close to the people playing, and I had my arms folded, and I was like, oh, I don't want them to think, that I'm not enjoying this. But I was smiling, and so I wasn't trying to convey, hey, this is not that good. So don't think that any one piece of body language means one thing. What you want to do when you go into a room is establish a baseline. You want to sit down and evaluate that person. What are they like? Do they seem nervous? Are they disheveled and sweating? Do they blink a lot? Are they very calm? What is their body language like? Give it a minute or two. Try to establish a baseline for what they're like. Because then when you start the meeting, if you start to have a conversation and you're like, it usually takes us about 2 weeks to deliver, and they go like this, they do what's known as a soothing gesture. There's a variety of soothing gestures: licking your lips, rubbing your legs, rubbing the back of your neck like that. That if it comes when you say something about pricing or deadline, whatever it is, note the deviation from the baseline behavior to whatever you're seeing there. And that will, again, they could just have an itch on the back of their neck. I don't want you to make your entire decision, oh, I better cut that by a week and get it to them a week because they rub their neck. No, but take it under advisement that, hey, maybe I need to circle back about that deadline, see if they continue to be uneasy about it, and use it as a data point to understand what they're going through a little bit there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've often people say, I cross my arms, that means I don't like it. I don't like what you're saying, or I don't like you in some ways. And I think it all depends upon the rest of the body posture.
Definitely.
So if I'm leaning back, I've got a stern expression on my face, it probably means I don't like it. But if I'm leaning forward with my arms crossed and I'm smiling or nodding my head, then it probably means something other than I'm dissatisfied. It may mean that's comfortable. That may mean that's a habit. It may mean I'm cold. There's a whole range of things that could be in that posture. So we're looking at it in the context. So no one single behavior. Are there other body language cues you pick up on?
Definitely. So we're talking a little bit about blocking behaviors there. So anything that someone does to put distance between themselves and you is called a blocking behavior. Again, it has to be context specific. I could get engaged in the blocking behavior of folding my arms, but I could be smiling and very engaged and laughing. So I would discount that. But if you're in a business meeting and you're talking and you bring up price and someone takes their coffee or their water bottle, whatever it is, and they put it directly in front of themselves, their handbag, whatever, and they put it on the table or something, these are blocking behaviors. They hear something and they're trying to put something between you and them. Even the smallest of items, even a pen, if they move something between you during the course of a conversation and deviate from the baseline that way, it's another important data point to take in. Another thing I talk about are territorial displays, which is kind of funny. We think about it on like the animal kingdom, but human beings do this too. So if you go in and you're interviewing for a board seat and the arrogant CEO leans back and puts his arm on both the conference room chairs, sprawls out his papers in front of him, spreads his leg and sits in a wide posture, he's telegraphing, hey, you're coming in here for this board interview, but you better know that I'm the CEO and I call the shots here. The board answers to me ultimately. That's what that person is kind of saying there, and you want to take in territorial displays. The policeman standing, with their arms in front of themselves, but their legs spread far apart is trying to signal dominance. And human beings do that. So read those kind of cues from people. There's quite a few other things. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that one of the ones that I think is really important and one you talk about as well is this whole notion of mimicking behavior. So when we're in synchrony, we're kind of aligned, we're seeing things the same way, at least in one part of the conversation. People literally become a mirror image of somebody else. You want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So mirroring is pretty widely known and I believe practiced in the business world, the physical replication of another person's behavior. And it has been shown over and over again. We have mirror neurons in our brain. And when we see people acting in a way similar to us, it makes us feel sympathetic towards them. It makes us feel aligned towards them. It shortcuts the rapport building process. So if your client is sitting on a table in front of you with his or her elbows on the table, leaning forward like this with their hands clasped, you want to do something similar. But you want to be careful with physical mirroring because if you do it badly, it can look like you're mocking somebody or, making fun of them. So you want to practice this in your everyday life and you want to be subtle about it and make it your own, right?
Yeah.
What I call the varsity move of mirroring is verbal mirroring. And it is an important tool in the toolkit of FBI hostage negotiators because when they show up on the siege of a scene, they're trying to quickly build rapport with the person and get them to calm down, the person who's taken people hostage. So they can't physically mirror that person because there's a divide. They're, outside and the person's inside. They're talking on a phone or a walkie-talkie. So what they do is really try to pick up on the language the other person is using and use the same language back to them. Use some of those same words. And they're looking very specifically also for pet words, colloquialisms. We all have little things that we tend to repeat. I have a friend, instead of saying yes, he often says 100%. Another that uses by the way in conversation a lot. These are guys I know very well. But when I'm speaking with them, I will use that because I want to practice my verbal mirroring chops. I want to make this practice second nature to me. And if I layer the verbal mirroring, which has the same impact mentally as physical mirroring, if I layer the verbal mirroring on top of the physical mirroring and keep it subtle, it's a very powerful way to get the person to think positively about us.
Right. There's a point, I believe, this is Alex Pentland's research, there's a point at which the physical mirroring is not controllable. Yes, we can be calling conscious attention to it, but if I'm really engaged in the conversation, I think it becomes an automatic behavior. So I often find this physical mirroring is a useful tool for saying, is the audience with me or not? Sure. Have I lost them? So that's one of the ways that I use it. And you can intentionally start, but if you're genuinely engaged in the conversation, things just happen. It's kind of hard to control all those behaviors along the way.
For sure.
Okay, any others that you want to call out on the body language that we haven't talked about?
Let's see, on body language. One of the things though, when it comes to detecting deception, which is a whole nother section, is we
Yes.
talk about how the body reveals what the mind conceals. So you want to, make sure you're paying attention to body language in conversation beyond just kind of the baseline. When someone is telling you something, you want to make sure they're not contradicting it with their body language. So the classic thing is, a detective has somebody in, they interview that person, and then they say, "Thank you very much. Mr. Jones, would you be willing to come back in if I have some more questions?" And the guy goes, "Oh, sure, I'd be happy to do that." But he's shaking his head because the body reveals what the mind conceals. So you need to be savvy and sort of keep an eye out for things. Somebody might be saying to you, "Oh, I would love to see you again. That sounds great." Or, "Do send us your pitch. I'll strongly consider it." But their feet are pointed towards the door. Or they're talking to you at a networking event and they're saying, "Let's definitely get lunch next Tuesday," but their feet are pointed away. The feet are really an honest part of the body. And, if someone's talking to you and their feet are pointed in the opposite direction, they want to leave and they might not be being truthful with you.
That is interesting about the feet being pointed in the wrong direction as or not pointed towards you as an indication. And I think people get this sideways unintentionally. So I think people will sometimes sit down in a conference room and they don't pay attention to square their body up with the table or with whomever they're talking to. They sit sort of sideways in the chair. Mm-hmm. And then you can find that you're twisted in awkward ways, and it is a weird signal in the body language. I watch people react to this really badly, so paying attention to the feet is a really cool thing. Okay, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. Jeremy, what other tips have we not talked about that you think would be really helpful to know in terms of being persuasive?
Yeah, well, I think, diffusing difficult encounters is a really important thing to think about as well. If you're in the business world, and I think a lot of your audience is, if you're, say a manager and someone comes into your office and they're super upset about something and you're seated behind your desk, well, there's a couple things you want to think about. If that person is kind of yelling and they're talking really fast, the first thing you want to do is, if they're standing up, invite them to sit. And because if they sit, it tends to calm things down right away. If they won't sit, don't stand up, because that will raise the temperature in the room in any confrontation. If they're still talking very fast and loudly, speak slowly and calmly. This is again from FBI hostage negotiators. People will revert to the social means that you are insisting upon. And you see this in groups of people talking. Sometimes everybody's very animated. They're all mirroring behaviors. We're all social animals in that way. So if someone's very angry, if you continue to speak calmly and slowly, they tend to eventually come to that point. Similarly, or continuing with diffusing those moments, let that person vent fully. Sometimes you might be tempted to cut them off. No, you're off base. You don't have the facts right. Let that person fully vent, and then ask clarification questions. How do you think we should solve this? Well, I think that we should be firing Jessica. She's a snake and she's blah, blah. And then just let them sit and say, okay, they just said something very extreme. Sometimes that'll deflate them and they'll say, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that." So there's a variety of things there too. A quick plug for a buddy of mine in the book. His name is BK. He's a really fantastic veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces, and he trains people about some of these things. And I won't use the colorful language, but he tells people, if you're involved in a situation on the street or something, if someone's upset, you want to identify, is it an F you or F this situation? Right. If it's F this, it's about the situation. And maybe there are things you can do together to solve the situation. If it's about F you and you understand that, well, there's different risk mitigation strategies you want to take to deal with somebody who's angry specifically at you. So identifying those things can be helpful.
Right. I love that part about the book, and we didn't talk about it, is this notion that most of the time you want to match somebody's behavior. But when they're overly agitated or angry or in a venting state or whatever, matching their behavior only escalates the problem. So Correct. You say, go to the polar opposite. Speak slowly, intentionally lower the tone of your voice, calm yourself down, stay seated, don't stand up to match them. All of those behaviors, you want to go to the polar opposite. Now, how do I do that, Jeremy, and still keep a connection? So don't people kind of go, "You're not connecting with me" at that moment? Or do they just eventually
you'll lose the connection if you stand up and start shouting at them too, because emotion trumps cognition. So people always say, why didn't I think of that witty reply I would have had in that argument? It's because you're full of emotion and it's taking over your brain. So if you have that connection and you want to save this person who's on your team, might not be doing the best job, but you still need them, you don't want to stand up and start yelling at them and have them storm off and walk out. Then the connection's over. The best way to preserve that connection is to do the opposite of some of the rapport building techniques, to take a step back. And ultimately, if you can't find a way to, diffuse it, is to call a timeout. One of Gary Nessner's book is called Stalling for Time. That's what hostage negotiators do. That's why they sometimes take such a long time. Let it cool off and try to put a pin in it and do it later.
Right. We've had a couple of hostage negotiators on the show, on the podcast. So you get some of that same advice, that building rapport with somebody. If somebody says something that's outrageous, then kind of go with it and say, well, tell me more about that. There's that connection, that intellectual curiosity, and the calming behavior as well. So it's very, very parallel. All right, Jeremy, if I think about this conversation and I try to extract all of this, I'm back to a couple of basics that are so easy to say and hard to practice. One is there's a humanity in every single human being that I interact with. Look for that, find that, try to understand more about their motivation. Get curious about them, about their worldview, about their understanding. Willingness to show something about yourself in a vulnerable way. Listen deeply. Try to listen actively. Try to have some empathy for them as well. And you've given us a couple of clues about the kind of questions to ask to elicit responses that give you information. So some great insights that I think work not just in the spy world, but in everybody's life, professional and otherwise. So thank you for being with us today.
It's been my great pleasure, Wanda. Thank you so much for what you do and for having me.
Thank you very much, and join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in for another edition next week with Dr. Wanda Wallace on the Voice America Business Channel. Reach outside your comfort zone this week.